In a cold room, a man signed the divorce with mockery, certain that he was burying once and for all a woman he considered weak, faded, and incapable of accompanying him in his ascent. Minutes later, before lawyers and a suffocating silence, an unexpected reading began to transform that arrogant victory into an impossible-to-control nightmare. What seemed to be just the humiliating end of a marriage revealed secrets kept for years, old wounds, hidden power, and an inheritance capable of turning the game in a devastating way. And when the truth finally emerged from the shadows, it became clear that the man who mocked the most was precisely the one who was walking, without realizing it, toward his own ruin. Before hearing this story of pride, betrayal, and relentless justice, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next reports. The notary's office was on the 12th floor of a grey building on Avenida Paulista, one of those that seem to have been built to make people feel small. At 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday, the sun came through the half-closed blinds, drawing yellow stripes on the marble floor. Rodrigo Cavalcante entered first, as he always did in any environment, preceding everyone with the same posture of someone who believes the world was made to receive him with open doors. He wore a charcoal grey Italian-tailored suit, the watch on his wrist shone discreetly, and his black leather shoes reflected the light from the hallway. He was 42 years old, with greying hair at the temples, a firm jaw, and a smile he used as a tool, not as an expression. Financial director of one of the largest infrastructure holdings in the country, Rodrigo was the type of man who considers his own presence a favor he does for the world. Behind him, 2 steps away, entered Fernanda. Fernanda Almeida Cavalcante was 38 years old and carried with her a quality that went unnoticed by those who were not paying attention: calmness. Not the calmness of someone who has given up, but the calmness of someone who knows something that others have not yet realized. She wore a beige linen blouse, dark pants, and her hair was held back with a simple clip. No jewelry, no strong perfume. She seemed, in her husband's eyes, exactly what he had decided she was: faded. Dr. Marcelo Tanaka, the lawyer responsible for the process, stood up to greet them. He was about 50 years old, with thin glasses and the neutral expression of someone who has witnessed enough not to be surprised by almost anything. Beside him, a legal assistant organized documents in a voluminous folder. Rodrigo didn't even wait to be invited to sit. He pulled out the chair, opened his jacket, and settled in as if he were presiding over a board meeting. "Let's get straight to the point," he said, crossing his arms over the table. "I have a meeting at 4 o'clock. I want this resolved before then." Fernanda sat on the opposite side of the table, without haste. She did not look at her husband. She took the glass of water the assistant offered and took a small sip slowly. Dr. Tanaka opened the folder and distributed copies of the agreement. There were 6 pages of dense legal language, but the summary was simple. Rodrigo would keep the apartment in Jardim Europa, the imported car, and the majority of the joint investments. Fernanda would receive a single lump sum of money, considered fair by him, and would disconnect from any participation in the assets acquired during the marriage. "Have you reviewed all of this?" Dr. Tanaka asked, looking at Fernanda. "I have," she replied in a quiet voice. Rodrigo let out a low, almost inaudible laugh and leaned slightly forward. "Good, because it would be tragic for you to need a second lawyer to understand what you are signing." The assistant pretended not to hear. Dr. Tanaka adjusted his glasses. Fernanda did not respond. She just looked at the paper in front of her. "You know," Rodrigo continued, settling into his chair with the confidence of someone enjoying the moment, "I spent years trying to raise your level. I tried to take you to events, introduce you to people who matter, show you how the world really works. But you never wanted to grow. You stayed in that nutrition office, seeing 3 patients a week, talking about recipes and dietary fibers, while I was building something real." Fernanda turned her head slightly toward him. There was no anger on her face. There was something more difficult to interpret. "You are a good person, Fernanda," he said, in the tone of someone offering condolences. "But being a good person is not enough for the world I live in. You never had ambition, and I cannot stand still waiting for someone who does not want to walk." "Rodrigo," Dr. Tanaka intervened delicately, Perhaps it is better if we focus on the documents. Of course. Rodrigo opened his hands on the table in a magnanimous gesture. You can sign, Fernanda. You will have enough to start over. Rent a small apartment, continue with your office. It will be good for you. Simpler. The way you like it. There was something in the way he said that which made every word an insult disguised as kindness. Fernanda picked up the pen that was on the table. For a second, Dr. Tanaka observed her with a different kind of attention, as if he were waiting for something. She signed the 3 copies with firm handwriting, without hesitating, without rereading, like someone who had already said goodbye a long time ago. Rodrigo signed right after, with an unnecessary flourish in his signature, the kind of stroke that says more about vanity than character. He tossed the pen back onto the table when he finished. Finally, he said, exhaling as if he had concluded a long and tedious task. Dr. Tanaka gathered the documents, organized the papers carefully, and before Rodrigo could stand up, spoke with the same quiet voice as always. There is a second procedure scheduled for this afternoon, Mr. Cavalcante. You were duly notified last October. It concerns the official reading of the will of Mr. Arnaldo Almeida, Mrs. Fernanda's father, which was registered in this office and must be read in the presence of both spouses or ex-spouses, as stated in the deceased's determination. Rodrigo stopped. He furrowed his brow with impatience. Can't this be rescheduled? No, sir. The testator's instructions are explicit regarding the date and the parties present. Mr. Arnaldo was very precise in his requests. A short silence settled in the room. Rodrigo leaned back in his chair with an expression of calculated boredom. What could be in that will that deserved his time? A small farm in some countryside town in Minas, perhaps, some old furniture, some bills to pay. The father-in-law who never addressed more than 6 words to him in all the years they were in the same family. A man who wore sandals with socks and drank filtered coffee from a worn-out thermos. What heritage could someone like that have left? Fine, Rodrigo said, unlocking his phone. I have 30 minutes. Fernanda looked out the window at the stripes of light on the blinds and said nothing. She just waited, with that calmness that Rodrigo always confused with weakness, but which was, in fact, something completely different. There was a photo of Arnaldo Almeida on the wall of the notary's hallway, alongside other institutional images, commemorative plaques, and framed certificates. Rodrigo passed by it without even looking. Fernanda stopped for a second, lightly touched the glass with her fingertip, like someone waving to someone who has already departed, and then entered the larger room where the reading would take place. The room had an oval table, leather chairs, and a window overlooking the irregular rooftops of São Paulo's expanded center. Waiting for them inside was Dr. Heitor Vasconcelos, a lawyer specialized in inheritance law, a man with white hair and upright posture who stood up when he saw them enter. Beside him was a woman of similar age who would be introduced as Dr. Claudia Mireles, the representative of the estate. Rodrigo sat down with his phone in hand, typing. Fernanda sat beside him, this time closer to the center of the table, as if that space belonged to her in a different way. Dr. Heitor placed a sealed, cream-colored paper envelope on the table with the name Arnaldo José Almeida handwritten on the front. Beside it, a thin folder. Before we begin, Dr. Heitor said, looking at both of them, I need to clarify that Mr. Arnaldo registered this will 2 years ago with all the formalities required by law. The document was witnessed, validated at the notary's office, and kept under custody since then. Mr. Arnaldo was a man of few words but very clear instructions. Rodrigo raised his eyes from his phone for a second, then went back to typing. You may continue, he said. Dr. Heitor opened the envelope carefully, unfolded the sheets and adjusted his glasses. I will begin with the description of the assets, he said. Mr. Arnaldo Almeida was the owner of a rural area of 1,200 hectares in the Triángulo Mineiro with complete land regularization, whose current market value was appraised at 18 million reais. Rodrigo stopped typing. Furthermore, Dr. Heitor continued without changing his tone, Mr. Arnaldo maintained a portfolio of variable and fixed income with a consolidated balance of 23 million reais, distributed across 3 different brokerage firms. In the room, the silence took on a different quality. Finally, Mr. Arnaldo was the holder of a technology patent applied to the treatment and reuse of water in industrial processes, registered 12 years ago, with active royalties and current contracts with 4 companies in the sanitation sector. The annual income from this patent is approximately 2,300,000 reais. Rodrigo Cavalcante sat motionless. The phone was loose in his hand, as if he had forgotten he was holding it. Fernanda did not move. She looked at the center of the table with the expression of someone who already knows the end of a story, but listens to it with respect nonetheless. Total inventoried assets, Dr. Hayter concluded, closing the folder for a moment, estimated at 43 million reais subject to the update of financial assets. The silence lasted longer than was comfortable. Rodrigo slowly turned his head toward Fernanda. She did not look at him. There is a destination clause, Dr. Hayter said, reopening the folder, and this is where Mr. Arnaldo was most precise. Rodrigo cleared his throat. He tried to regain his posture, his controlled expression, the voice of a man who is surprised by nothing. But there was something in his eyes, a small and nervous agitation, that betrayed everything. The totality of the assets is destined to his only daughter, Fernanda Almeida, the doctor read. Without restrictions, without compulsory partition, with full ownership and immediate administration, starting from the date of the reading of this document. Rodrigo relaxed a millimeter. There was still the marriage, there was still the community of property, there was still a way. He began to calculate. However, Dr. Hayter said, and there was a weight in that word that made Rodrigo stiffen again, Mr. Arnaldo established a conditional clause, which I transcribe in its entirety. He held up the sheet. I know my daughter. I also know the man she married. I observed him for years with an attention he never devoted to me. I saw how he treats what he considers inferior, how he discards what does not serve him, and how he confuses value with appearance. Therefore, I establish the following. If the marriage between Fernanda and Rodrigo Cavalcante is dissolved by his initiative, by proven infidelity, or by any voluntary act of Rodrigo that signifies the formal breaking of the marital bond, including the signing of separation or divorce documents, all rights that Brazilian legislation could eventually attribute to the spouse over these assets are extinguished without the possibility of appeal, given that the inheritance consists exclusively of private assets prior to the marriage and protected by a deed of incommunicability registered at the notary's office. Dr. Hayter lowered the sheet. He looked at Rodrigo over his glasses. The deed of incommunicability was registered 15 years ago, he added, before the marriage. Rodrigo did not breathe for a few seconds. The signature you affixed today to the divorce agreement, the doctor continued, with the same neutral voice of someone reading minutes, constitutes exactly the act foreseen in the clause. The documents signed in the adjacent notary's office less than an hour ago have already been registered in the system. The process is irreversible. The chair creaked slightly as Rodrigo leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands joined in front of his face like someone praying or someone trying to hold on to something that is escaping. This is not possible, he said in a low and controlled voice. This is a trap. This is bad faith. It is a valid will, Dr. Claudia Meireles said, speaking for the first time, with a serenity that sounded like a wall. Registered, witnessed, and legally irreproachable. Fernanda finally turned to Rodrigo. There was no triumph on her face. There was only the same calmness as always, and perhaps underneath it, something that vaguely resembled sadness. You asked for the apartment, the car, and freedom, she said softly. They are all yours. And then she turned back to the lawyers, like someone closing a minor matter before starting what really mattered. Rodrigo left the notary's office at 3:40 in the afternoon, with his tie loosened for the first time in years. He went down the 12 floors in the elevator alone, eyes fixed on the mirrored door, seeing his own reflection without really seeing anything. Outside Avenida Paulista was noise, heat, people. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, like someone who came out of a dark room and is still adjusting to the light. The phone vibrated. It was Viviane. Viviane Loureiro was 36 years old, a new business manager at the same holding where Rodrigo worked, and for 2 years she had fed Rodrigo's certainty that he deserved more than he had. She was intelligent, ambitious, always wore her hair straight, and knew exactly what to say when he needed to feel important. When the message appeared on the screen, he turned off the phone and put it in his pocket. It was not the moment for Viviane. He walked to the car, sat in the driver's seat, and remained still for almost 5 minutes before putting the key in the ignition. He did calculations. He reviewed every detail of the clause Dr. Heiter had read. He thought about contesting it, hiring another lawyer, alleging some procedural failure. But he knew, with the intuition of someone who spent 20 years in the financial market, that the will was solid. Arnaldo Almeida, the man who wore sandals with socks and never spoke more than necessary, had built a perfect trap with the patience of someone who has plenty of time, and Rodrigo had walked into it alone, running. Back at the apartment in Jardim Europa, which was now definitely his, he poured himself a drink he didn't finish and called Dr. Felipe Assunção, his personal lawyer, a man who usually solved problems before they turned into crises. "Have you ever heard of an incommunicability clause registered before marriage?" Rodrigo asked without a greeting. There was a pause on the other side. "I have. Why?" "Because I just lost 43 million reais because of one." The conversation was long, technical, and at the end, devastating. Dr. Felipe confirmed what Rodrigo already suspected. The clause was valid. The registration was prior to the marriage. The legal protection was complete. The inheritance had never been subject to community property. Even if the marriage continued, Rodrigo would have no right to those assets. The conditional clause of the will only guaranteed that if he acted as he in fact did, he would lose even the theoretical possibility of any dispute. "Is there anything I can do?" Rodrigo asked. "You can try to contest the will alleging psychological pressure or incapacity of the testator, but you would need to prove that Mr. Arnaldo was not in full capacity when he signed, and according to the documents you described, he was. So there is nothing. Not in the way you are thinking." Rodrigo hung up the phone and stood looking at the apartment around him. White walls, designer furniture, a privileged view of the park. Everything he had considered proof of his success. And suddenly, it seemed just like a collection of expensive objects he had bought to convince himself of something that was never as true as he imagined. In the following days, life went on with the appearance of normality that proud men cultivate so as not to show a wound. Rodrigo went to work, presided over meetings, signed reports. Viviane noticed that something had changed and tried an approach that he deflected with vague excuses. There was no mood for it. There was no disposition. Fernanda, for her part, did not disappear. On the contrary, a week after the reading of the will, she appeared at Dr. Heiter's office to begin the asset transfer procedures. She gave power of attorney to 2 specialists in wealth management, talked at length with the lawyers about the patent, the royalty contracts, the situation of the lands. There was a version of Fernanda that Rodrigo had never known, because he had never wanted to. The nutritionist with the small office that he dismissed as faded was also the only daughter of Arnaldo Almeida, who grew up listening to her father talk about land, money, patience, and the difference between those who make noise and those who build in silence. Arnaldo had started as a sanitation technician in a small interior town. Over the years, he identified a recurring problem in the reuse of industrial effluents and developed, alone and without external sponsorship, a technical solution that was patented with the help of an engineer friend. The patent took time to take off, but when the sanitation market expanded and environmental requirements increased, it became a reference. Arnaldo never moved to São Paulo. He never flaunted. He never needed to. Fernanda knew all of this. She didn't comment because no one had asked. While she organized the future, Rodrigo fought another battle. The holding where he worked was undergoing an internal audit. Routine, it's true, but Rodrigo knew that some decisions from the last 2 years would not withstand a very rigorous scrutiny. There was one operation in particular, an asset restructuring that he had conducted with excessive autonomy, which had generated losses that were diluted in subsequent reports. Nothing he couldn't explain, he told himself. But the explanation depended on no one asking the right questions in the right order. And then, on a Friday morning, he received a message from the assistant to the president of the holding. An extraordinary meeting had been called for the following Monday. Agenda: presentation of the results of the internal audit of financial management for the last 24 months. Rodrigo read the message 3 times, then he went to the window and stood looking at the city below, with that expression of someone starting to realize that the ground he judged firm was, in fact, being pulled out from under his feet for much longer than he imagined. On the weekend before the meeting, Rodrigo locked himself in the apartment with the reports from the last 2 years spread across the dining table. He spent hours reorganizing numbers, rereading calculation memories, preparing justifications for every decision he had made outside of the formal committees. He worked with the concentration of someone building a defense, not a presentation. Vivian tried to call twice. He did not answer. On Monday, he arrived early at the office. The holding occupied 3 floors of a corporate tower in the Faria Lima region, and Rodrigo knew every meter of that space like someone who knows his own territory. He greeted doormen, assistants, and analysts with his usual naturalness, without letting any tension show. That was what he was good at, the performance of normality. The meeting room had a capacity for 30 people. There were 22 when he entered. The president of the holding, Sergio Drummond, was sitting at the head of the table, in a white shirt without a tie, with a stern expression. Beside him, 2 men Rodrigo did not immediately recognize, but who had the specific appearance of external consultants: organized folders, open laptops, that professional distance of someone who does not belong to the internal hierarchy and therefore owes loyalty to no one. Rodrigo sat 2 places away from Sergio, in the position he occupied in every meeting. He placed his folder on the table. He waited. The consultants presented the report for 40 minutes. It was detailed, chronological, with graphs and tables that documented the financial decisions of the board over the last 2 years. Most of it was conventional, until they reached the 3rd quarter of the previous year. There the presentation slowed down. The asset restructuring operation that Rodrigo had conducted was described with a surgical precision that made him feel heat under his jacket. The consultants documented how the losses of a subsidiary had been absorbed by another unit without the proper approval of the committee, how subsequent reports presented the operation in a way that made the real impact almost invisible, and how the financial board's bonus for the period had been calculated based on numbers that did not reflect the actual situation of the company. Rodrigo opened his mouth to speak, but Sergio Drummond raised his hand slightly. Let them finish. The consultant moved forward 2 more slides. Our analysis identified that these operations did not have the necessary authority to be conducted autonomously. The decision should have been submitted to the executive committee. It was not. Rodrigo found a firm voice to say, "That was a technical decision within my sphere of competence. The documentation is available and shows that—" "The documentation is here," the consultant interrupted him with courtesy, touching the laptop screen, "and it is exactly what we are analyzing." After the presentation ended, there was a pause for those present to read an executive summary that had been distributed. Rodrigo read every line with the feeling of seeing his own name in a process he no longer controlled. The meeting ended without formal conclusions. Sergio Drummond asked everyone to wait for an internal announcement by the end of the day. The consultants closed their laptops and left first. Rodrigo was one of the last to stand up. As he passed through the door, Sergio called him by name. "Stay a second." The 2 were left alone in the room. Sergio was not a dramatic man. He said things directly without beating around the bush, with the same objectivity with which he had built a company from scratch. "Rodrigo, you know what this means." "I know it was misinterpreted. I can explain every—" "You already explained to the consultants. They already explained to the anchor investors last night." Rodrigo stopped. "The investors already know." "They know. And there is a representative of the main creditors who asked for a meeting on Thursday. You know their position in this holding, right?" Rodrigo knew. He had studied that structure for years. There was a block of senior debt of the company that was in the hands of an investment fund. And whoever controlled that position had direct influence over strategic decisions in case of irregularities. It was a protection clause that the creditors had demanded when the holding took out the larger loan 6 years ago. He himself had negotiated part of that contract. "Who is the representative?" Rodrigo asked, still trying to understand the extent of what was happening. Sergio picked up a paper on the table and slid it toward Rodrigo. It was a formal letter, on the letterhead of a wealth management office, communicating the intention to exercise the supervision rights provided for in the contract. The name at the bottom was Fernanda Almeida, representative of the Almeida Participation Fund. Rodrigo stared at the paper for longer than any dignified reaction would allow. Arnaldo Almeida had bought that debt position 2 years ago, when the market was down and the bond was undervalued. It was not the type of investment that drew attention. It was the type of move someone makes when they understand much more than they appear to. And now that bond was in Fernanda's hands. "She will be here on Thursday," Sergio said, "with lawyers and an independent financial analyst. Rodrigo, you need to prepare a very good response, or consider other alternatives." Rodrigo left the room with the folder in his hand, passed through the hallway where the analysts' desks were, went down the elevator, reached the building's lobby, and only then, alone between the glass and the cold marble, realized that the woman he had called faded was about to enter through the same door he had crossed every day for the last 8 years. And this time, it would not be to visit him. On Wednesday night, Rodrigo tried to call Fernanda. The phone rang 3 times and she answered with a calm voice, like someone who was waiting for a routine call. "You know why I'm calling," he said. "I imagine so. I need you to understand that that operation was taken in good faith. There was an internal communication problem. There was no intention to harm anyone." Fernanda did not answer immediately. From the background of the line, he heard the soft sound of a chair being adjusted, as if she was settling in for a conversation that would not be quick. "Rodrigo," she said, "what do you want from me?" "I want you to consider not going to that meeting, or that you go with a more collaborative posture. You have influence over that bond. You can ask for a deadline, a friendly review. You don't need to turn this into a crisis." "It already is a crisis," she said, with the same softness as always. "Only you created it alone." "Fernanda, please. You asked me for a divorce in writing. You loosened my terms. You called me simple in front of the lawyer and said I didn't have enough ambition for your world. Now you are asking me for a favor." He did not answer. "I am going to the meeting tomorrow because it is my obligation as a representative of the fund. Not out of resentment, not out of revenge. Because my father built that position for a reason, and I have responsibility over it." The call ended. Rodrigo stared at the ceiling of the apartment for a long time. On Thursday morning, Fernanda arrived at the Faria Lima building in a discreet car, accompanied by Dr. Heitor Vasconcelos and a financial analyst named Renata Borges, who had spent 2 weeks immersed in the holdings reports. Fernanda wore a navy blue blazer, black pants, and no flashy accessories. She had the same appearance she always had, direct, without ornamentation, difficult to fit into simple categories. At the reception, they were met by Sergio Drummond's assistant and led to the same floor where, 2 days earlier, the consultants had presented the report. The room was different, fewer people, but with more weight. Sergio, 2 board members of the holding, the legal director, and at the back of the table Rodrigo, who stood up when they entered with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Fernanda greeted Sergio with a firm handshake, greeted the board members, and ignored Rodrigo with a naturalness that seemed rehearsed for years. The meeting began with the analyst Renata presenting a 17-page document that dismantled the asset restructuring operation piece by piece. The analysis was not just technical, it was narrative. It showed the sequence of decisions, the absence of formal records in mandatory steps, the way the results had been presented internally, and how that differed from the actual results. It was the type of work that requires months of dedication and precise access to internal information. Rodrigo tried to interrupt 3 times. Each time, he was politely requested to wait. When Renata finished, Fernanda took the floor for the first time. She spoke for less than 5 minutes, but every sentence had the weight of someone who chose words with care. "The Almeida Fund did not come here to terminate contracts or create instability. We came because the documents indicate that the creditors' interests were compromised by unauthorized decisions, and that the information made available to investors did not reflect the financial reality of the company. This is not a matter of interpretation, it is a matter of record. Sergio Drummond nodded slowly. The holding's legal director asked for a 15-minute break so that the internal team could deliberate. Fernanda, Renata, and Dr. Heitor waited in an adjacent lounge, drinking coffee in silence. Fernanda looked out the window at the same kind of view Rodrigo contemplated every day. The city below, vast and indifferent, and thought of her father. Of his way of turning off the news when it got too loud, of preferring the house porch to the center of things, of saying that the best position in a negotiation was that of someone who needs nothing the other person has. When they returned to the room, Sergio was standing. "We need to make some internal decisions before responding formally to the fund, but I want to be transparent. The report presented is consistent with what our own audit identified. We are going to need changes in management." Rodrigo remained still in his chair, with his hands crossed over the folder he had not opened since the beginning of the meeting. "Rodrigo," Sergio said, turning to him, "legal will get in touch later today." It was a small sentence, but everyone in the room understood what it contained. Fernanda did not look at Rodrigo when she left. There was no need. When the elevator closed and she was alone with Renata and Dr. Heitor, the analyst said, with a slight smile, "Your father knew what he was doing." Fernanda agreed with her head without smiling. He knew. He always knew. Arnaldo Almeida had spent decades observing his son-in-law with the silent attention of someone who understands that certain people only reveal what they truly are when they believe they have nothing left to lose. And when the right moment arrived, with the patience of someone who cultivates the land without haste, he had left everything prepared so that his daughter would not have to fight. Only witness. Up there on the 17th floor, Rodrigo Cavalcante sat at the empty table after everyone had left, looking at the city through the glass. At some point in the last few days, without him noticing, the ground had completely changed under his feet. And the worst part was that it had been he himself who put every piece in place with such conviction, with such pride, without suspecting for a second that the man in sandals with socks had spent years observing his every move, patiently waiting for the day when arrogance would collect the right price. Rodrigo Cavalcante's dismissal was communicated in writing on Friday morning by email, with a copy to the Human Resources and Legal departments. It was the type of announcement large companies make when they want to leave a record that they acted according to procedures, even if everyone knows the decision was already made before any protocol was followed. The text was formal, citing incompatibility with governance standards, and informing him that he would be escorted to collect his personal belongings on the same day. Rodrigo arrived at the office without knowing that the announcement had already circulated. When he stepped out of the elevator and saw the two security guards beside a cardboard box in the hallway near his room, he stopped. He looked at the box. He looked at the security guards. He said nothing for a few seconds. "Can you give me a moment?" he said. "Of course, Mr. Cavalcante, we are here when you need us." He entered the room, stood in the center, looked at the pictures on the wall, at the large desk, at the view of the city he had looked at for 8 years, with the feeling that it was proof that he had arrived. Then he gathered the photo of the set of books that decorated the shelf, the business cards from when he was a senior analyst trying to become a manager, a mug with the logo of a course he had taken years ago. He put everything in the box with precise movements, without rushing, without setting aside the surface dignity that was the last thing he had left. When he left with the box in his arms, he ran into Viviane Loureiro in the hallway. She had an expression that tried to be neutral, but it was possible to see underneath it that quick evaluation that ambitious people make when faced with someone who has just lost power. How much of this still serves me? The answer was in the way she took a step to the side and said "good luck," with that tone of a phrase that doesn't mean good luck, but rather goodbye. Rodrigo passed her without stopping. Outside, sitting in the back seat of a rideshare car, with the box on his knees and the city passing by the window, he called lawyer Felipe Asuncao. "I was fired. I already heard. They sent me yesterday's documents. Rodrigo, I need to tell you something clearly. Contesting the dismissal will draw more attention to the irregularities. The best thing now is a silent agreement. And the accusations about the operation? There was a pause. There is a formal inquiry underway by the CVM Brazilian SEC audit. I received it early today. Rodrigo closed his eyes. The Securities and Exchange Commission had been triggered. This meant that what had started as an internal audit was becoming something larger, with implications that went beyond the lost job. I need immediate representation in this process, Rodrigo said. I know, but I need you to tell me everything, Rodrigo. Everything, without omissions. The conversation continued for another 40 minutes while the car crossed the city in the afternoon traffic. When it ended, Rodrigo remained in silence for a long time, with his phone in hand, looking at the movement outside without really seeing anything. That night, he took the initiative that a desperate person takes when they feel control is completely escaping. He tried to create an alternative narrative. He called 2 journalists he knew, people with whom he had exchanged information over the years, and suggested there was a story to be told about the Almeida Fund, about how a recent heiress had used a position acquired by her father to pressure a company and favor her own interests. He presented it as an anonymous source, as someone from the inside who was being silenced. One of the journalists listened carefully and then said, "Rodrigo, this story doesn't add up. The fund belonged to her father for 2 years. She didn't buy anything. She inherited it. And the operation you guys did is documented. There's no angle." But there's no angle, Rodrigo. The second journalist didn't even call back. In the following days, while Rodrigo gathered papers and prepared for what the CVM process could bring, Fernanda was in Uberlandia. She had gone to her father's lands for the first time since he had departed. The farm manager, Mr. Otavio, was 70 years old, had a white mustache and knew every inch of that place as if it were an extension of his own body. He was moved when he saw her step out of the car. "Miss Fernanda, just like Mr. Arnaldo in the way you walk." They spent 2 days visiting every area. Fernanda listened more than she spoke, took more notes than she said. There were projects her father had started, partnerships with local cooperatives, an agreement with a producers' association that he had negotiated personally. None of that had glamour. All of it had substance. One afternoon, sitting on the porch of the simple house her father had never renovated because he saw no reason to, Fernanda looked at the open field horizon and thought of the scene at the notary's office, at the way Rodrigo had signed the divorce like someone discarding a useless note, and she felt with clarity that there was no resentment there. There was only the recognition that some people are so convinced they have already reached the top that they never look at the ground where they are stepping. Her father had stepped on that ground for decades. He had built on it with care, brick by brick, in silence. And when the time came, the ground was firm enough to support everything that was needed. Fernanda took out her phone and called Dr. Hayter. "I want to organize a foundation for the management of the lands, with a focus on sanitation and water access projects. That is what makes sense." "Understood. Whenever you want to start, just say the word." She hung up, stayed a bit longer looking at the field, and then went inside to help Mr. Otavio prepare afternoon coffee. She had a lot of work ahead, and for the first time in years, that thought did not feel heavy. It was simply the truth. The formal CVM inquiry was officially opened 3 weeks after the meeting at the holding. The administrative process cited Rodrigo Cavalcante by name and described the irregularities with technical language that, translated into the simple Portuguese he so much despised, meant the following. You used your position to conduct an operation that harmed the company, omitted real losses, and calculated your own bonus based on numbers that were not true. Dr. Felipe Asuncion worked hard in the first weeks trying to build a line of defense based on delegation of authority and technical interpretation of internal norms. It was a possible defense, but fragile, because it depended on an ambiguity that the holdings documents did not clearly support. With every new request for documents by the CVM, Rodrigo's position became a bit harder to defend. The apartment in Jardim Europa, which he had kept as a trophy of the divorce, began to seem too large. He spent his nights in a closed routine, woke up early, read the lawyer's emails, tried to organize papers, had lunch alone, went to the gym as if physical regularity could compensate for the lack of control over everything else, returned, had a drink, slept poorly. The phone rang less every week. Corporate contacts are efficient at noticing when someone no longer has anything to offer. Viviane had disappeared completely. She didn't send a message, didn't call, didn't speak out in any way. Rodrigo learned, through a mutual colleague, that she had temporarily assumed part of the responsibilities that were his at the holding, and that she was positioning herself well for the restructuring process that would come with the new management. She was intelligent, she always was. He had mistaken that intelligence for loyalty because she was convenient while he had power. Now he understood the mistake with the unpleasant clarity of things that only become obvious too late. In one sleepless dawn, he found himself scouring his memory for any moment when Fernanda had tried to warn him about something he didn't want to hear, and he found many. Not screams, not fights, not dramatic scenes, she had never done that. But there was that way of hers of staying quiet when he spoke ill of her father, of changing the subject when he commented on money and prestige, of leaving the room when the conversation took a tone she didn't tolerate. He had interpreted all of this as resignation. It was, in fact, a way of not wasting energy on someone who was not ready to hear her. While the process advanced, Rodrigo took a decision that Dr. Felipe firmly advised against. He decided to file a complaint with the holdings board of directors, alleging that the report presented by the Almeida Fund had been built based on privileged information obtained through Fernanda's personal access to documents she had come into contact with during the marriage. It was a baseless allegation, the lawyer himself said so clearly, but Rodrigo was operating in that stage where the pain of doing nothing exceeds the risk of doing something wrong. The complaint was analyzed by the holdings legal department in 2 days and discarded. The opinion was short. There was no evidence of undue access to documents. The fund's analysis had been based exclusively on public information and on the records legally provided by the company within the scope of the audit process. And the allegation had no factual support. The opinion was filed. But the fact that he had made the attempt was recorded. The most unexpected response came from a source he had not considered. Arnaldo Almeida had kept for years a diary of professional records. It was a common notebook with a black hard cover where he wrote down meetings, impressions, and observations about the companies in which he had invested or with which he had had contact. It was the type of habit a previous generation of entrepreneurs cultivated before note apps took over everything. The diary had been found among the father's belongings by Fernanda during the organization of the inheritance. She had not looked for anything about Rodrigo there, but the notes about the holding were detailed. Arnaldo had observed from afar the pattern of the company's financial decisions over years, motivated by the position he had acquired as a creditor. In some entries he cited his son-in-law by name, without moral judgment, only with the objectivity of someone describing a behavior trend, decisions taken outside of formal channels, operations conducted with suspicious speed near the bonus calculation period, inconsistencies in reports that only became visible when comparing 2 different versions of the same document. It was not proof of anything, it was observation, but it was a documented, chronological and consistent observation with everything the audit had revealed. When Dr. Felipe learned of the diary's existence through the estate's lawyer, he was silent for a long moment. Rodrigo, those notes confirm the pattern the CVM is investigating. This was not built to get you. Your father-in-law simply observed and wrote what he saw. He hated me, Rodrigo said. From the records, it doesn't look like hate. It looks like concern for his daughter and for an investment he had made. The notes are technical, not personal. That, in a way, was even more disconcerting. Rodrigo had built in recent months a narrative in which Arnaldo was an adversary, someone who had planned to destroy him out of rancor, out of jealousy, out of some veiled animosity that the two had never resolved. But the notebooks did not show an enemy. They showed a father who had observed a man difficult to change, who had protected his daughter with the tools he knew, and who had recorded what he saw with the seriousness of someone who knows that one day those records might be necessary. Rodrigo had not been destroyed by malice, he had been documented by clarity, and this distinction, for some reason he couldn't completely name, was the hardest part to swallow. The CVM administrative process lasted 6 months. At the end, Rodrigo Cavalcante received a penalty that included the partial return of the bonuses received during the period of the irregular operation, the temporary suspension from exercising financial management functions in publicly traded companies, and a fine that consumed a considerable part of the reserves he had saved over the years. There was no criminal conviction, no prison, none of that cinematic outcome that trial narratives sometimes produce. There was only the slow and embarrassing bureaucracy of accountability, which makes no noise but cuts deep. The apartment in Jardim Europa had to be put up for sale when it became clear that the legal costs and the absence of income required an urgent financial reorganization. The car was the first to go. The apartment took 3 months to find a buyer, in a market that was on the rise but requires patience from those who don't have much. Rodrigo moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in Pinheiros, in a building without a doorman, without a gym. Without that view, he had considered the natural landscape of his life. On the first weekend, he woke up at 6 in the morning with the noise from the street and stared at the ceiling with an expression that was not exactly sadness. It was more the estrangement of someone who is still learning the dimension of the space in which they now exist. He tried to resume his career. He had real knowledge, years of experience, a network of contacts that had not yet completely evaporated. But the high-level financial market has selective memory. It quickly forgets those who leave through the back door, but it records those who left with an administrative process to their name. Initial conversations were cordial, lunches happened, but concrete offers did not come. There was always a lateral reason, an ongoing restructuring, bad timing. Dr. Felipe Asunção suggested, with the honesty of someone who charges a lot but delivers clarity, that professional recovery would take time and would depend on how Rodrigo managed the coming years. "It's not impossible," he said, "but you will need to build again. Start smaller." Rodrigo heard that with the same difficulty all people have when they are instructed to do something they were always taught was defeat. While he reconstituted what he could, Fernanda had officially started the Arnaldo Almeida Foundation, focused on projects for access to clean water and sanitation in small municipalities in the north and northeast regions. The foundation used part of the royalties from her father's patent and had formed partnerships with 2 international organizations active in the field. Renata Borges, the analyst who had presented the report at the holding meeting, accepted the invitation to lead the financial arm of the foundation. The nutrition office, which Rodrigo had described as an activity of 3 patients a week, had grown discreetly in recent years. Fernanda kept it not because she needed it financially, but because they were the people with whom she had spent years building trust, one consultation at a time. She passed the management to a trusted colleague and kept only 1 weekly shift, more out of affection than necessity. There was a scene that returned to Rodrigo with a frequency he had not foreseen, the moment when Dr. Heitor had read the clause of the will aloud. Not the part about the inheritance, not the numbers, the part where Arnaldo had written that he had observed his son-in-law for years with the attention that the son-in-law never devoted to him. That sentence, more than anything else that had happened in recent months, stuck. There was in it a diagnosis so precise that it resisted time. Rodrigo had spent years beside an extraordinary man and had recognized nothing. He had dismissed every aspect of Arnaldo as evidence of insignificance, without ever asking where that man came from, what he had built, what he had learned. Arrogance is not just the certainty of being superior. It is also, perhaps primarily, the refusal to learn from those who do not have the appearance of power. On a morning in March, about 8 months after the divorce, Rodrigo crossed paths with Fernanda by chance in a bakery in Itaim. She was with a woman who was laughing at something, and the two had the relaxation of a conversation without weight. Fernanda saw him before he said anything and did not look away. She just nodded slightly, with a gesture that was neither cold nor warm, just real. He nodded back. She turned back to her friend and continued the conversation. Rodrigo ordered his coffee, sat at a table near the window, and stayed there for longer than he normally would. There was something in that casual encounter that summed up everything. She had moved on, not as a performance, not as a statement, but simply because there was life to be lived and she was living it, without visible resentment, without flaunted triumph. With that calmness that he always confused with weakness, but which was, as he finally understood, the mark of someone who never needed external approval to know who they were. He drank his coffee slowly, looked at the street and thought for the first time, without the sharp pain of the first months, that there was a kind of lesson in the events of recent times that did not need theatricality to be real. It was simple and costly in the same way simple things usually are. He had spent his whole life evaluating people by what they displayed and had completely lost sight of what they built. The price of that mistake had been exact. A year after the afternoon at the notary's office on Avenida Paulista, the Triangulo Minero was in the middle of the dry season. The pastures turned golden in the late afternoon, the sky took on colors that the big city could not reproduce, and the porch of Arnaldo Almeida's simple house, which now belonged to Fernanda, had an old straw chair that creaked slightly every time someone sat down. Fernanda was sitting in that chair when her phone rang with an alert for a message from Dr. Hayter. The first projects of the foundation had been approved by one of the partner international organizations. 3 municipalities in the northeastern Sertão would receive water catchment and treatment systems based, in part, on the patent Arnaldo had developed decades ago in a hotel room in Uberlandia, with graph paper and a hydraulic engineering book he had borrowed from the public library. She stared at the message for a moment and then closed the phone. There was time to respond. Now she just wanted to stay there in that chair, with the wind passing through the treetops and Mr. Ottavio in the corral below, conducting the routine of decades with the tranquility of someone who knows that work is what it is, regardless of who is watching. The foundation already had a small but committed team. Renata Borges had proven to be more than a competent analyst. She was someone with long-term vision and a rare capacity to translate financial data into human decisions. The two had developed a work partnership that had the quality of collaborations that grow slowly and stay. The office had begun to serve exclusively patients in nutritional vulnerability in partnership with 2 basic health units in the city. Fernanda saw patients on Tuesdays. It was little, but it was concrete. And concreteness, she had learned from her father, is worth more than reach. The lands were being managed with the same philosophy Arnaldo had practiced, without haste, without expansion for expansion's sake, with attention to what the land asks for and what the people around need. The local cooperative continued the partnership, and there was a reforestation project for degraded areas that Fernanda had personally approved after a field visit. She had not become another person. She had become more completely who she already was. Sometimes on nights when she stayed later on the porch with a book, or just looking at the sky, she thought of her father, of his way of looking at things without needing to name them, of the way he had built an entire life without ever needing anyone to know how much he had built. There was a specific dignity in that which Fernanda had spent years observing without knowing she was learning. Arnaldo had never told her what he had planned with the will. He had not asked for approval, he had not consulted, he had not warned. He had only prepared everything with the silent certainty of someone who knows his daughter and knows she will not waste what is left. It was the highest form of trust, the kind that does not need to explain itself. Fernanda was left owing him a conversation that never happened. But there was something that was better than the conversation. There was the work, there were the lands, there were the sanitation projects that bore his name on a discreet plaque at the entrance of each municipality served. There was the straw chair creaking on the porch of the house he had built when he was young, and that she had chosen not to renovate, because some things are better when they remain as they are. In São Paulo, Rodrigo Cavalcanti had accepted a position as a financial consultant in a medium-sized company, without glamour, without a director title, without the kind of visibility he had nurtured for so many years. It was smaller. It was real. There were days when he still felt the internal resistance of someone who was taught to measure the value of a position by the size of the office. But there was also, growing slowly, something that felt like the relief of someone who stopped supporting a weight they chose to carry alone. He had not spoken to Fernanda again after the nod in the bakery. There was no reason for it, and he knew it. There were things that had no fix, not out of drama, but out of simple reality. What had been done was done, what was said, and what was signed was signed. The world continued. People continued. On the porch in Uberlandia, Fernanda stood up from the chair, entered the house, turned on the kitchen light and began to prepare dinner with the calmness of someone who has a place to be. Outside, the sky was getting dark, the first stars appearing over the land that her father had loved in silence all his life. And there was in all of that a peace that was not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of direction, knowing what matters, knowing what to build, knowing that the value of a life is not measured by what one flaunts, but by what one leaves behind, that is true in the world when one goes. This was Arnaldo Almeida's legacy. Not the 43 million, not the patent, not the lands. It was the certainty, transmitted without words, that building with patience and living with integrity is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. End of story. Dear listeners, the story of Fernanda and Arnaldo reminds us that what we build in silence can speak louder than any word said at the right time. If this narrative touched you, if it made you think, if it brought someone to mind, then it fulfilled what it needed to fulfill. Here on the Noites de Lendas Esquecidas channel, we bring stories that illuminate the complexity of life with the care of those who believe that every narrative has the power to change how we see the world around us. If you are not yet subscribed, subscribe now and activate the bell so you don't miss any new episode. Leave your comment telling us what you felt hearing this story. What marked you the most? The patient father, Fernanda's dignity, or that moment at the notary's office that changes everything? Your comment feeds this community. And if you want to continue on this journey, we have prepared a special playlist with equally moving stories waiting for you. Until the next episode.